Okay, so as we continue to look at the life of Paul, we really finished up at this point Paul and Barnabas' journey. Um, but just to kind of pause for a second as we head into looking at this, uh, we started with a class with saying one of my goals is for you to understand Paul as a person, and thinking about undertaking this and what kind of a person would do this, where you just leave a city where you know everybody and you begin to travel around, and they make this giant loop going through Cyprus and then up through Perga and Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, and they go into towns that they've never been, or at least never been as Christians, right? It's likely that Barnabas had some familiarity with Cyprus. Whether Paul did previous to this journey, we don't know. Paul probably had some familiarity with the places like Derbe and Lystra simply because they were close to Tarsus, where he was from. But as Christians going and bringing the gospel, like, this is just a fresh thing. And I'll run into this sometimes where I talk to guys who will do foreign work, and the very first time they go, they always come back like with eyes like this big, because the culture is different, the food is different, and how you talk to people that works is different. And you go to China, and how you're going to talk to people to talk to them about the gospel is very different than how you're going to talk to Americans. And you also just kind of show up. And you have to show up and just start looking for opportunities where you can, and you pray about it. There's a brother that spent time in Vietnam, and the plane landed, and they just started praying for opportunities, and were going to street corners, and somebody found out that they spoke English and said, "Oh, well, why don't you come over and speak at this thing? We'd like to hear English." And that was the inroads to them ending up having a chance to preach the gospel. But you just imagine this idea of you land, the plane lands, you walk off, and you're just in a city, and you go, okay, what now? How do we do this? That's essentially what Paul and Barnabas had to do. They would go into a city, they would go to a synagogue if there was one, and begin looking for opportunities, praying for opportunities, and then all of a sudden you're sitting there in the synagogue, and one of the synagogue officials says, "Well, do you have anything to say to us? Now's your chance." Well, where do you start? I mean, you can imagine how daunting something this is, and how you really learn to trust in God. And I think as we go through tonight, that's one of the things I want you to really see, is how much Paul had to learn to just trust in God for the process. So in this first journey, they go through all of these territories, going through Cyprus, then going up to Perga and Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. There in Lystra, Paul is stoned and left for dead. The people who stoned him think, "Yep, that was good enough, we killed him," which tells you everything you need to know about how badly he got beat. He looked dead. And so from Lystra, they move on to Derbe, but then the shocking thing is what happens next. After being in Derbe for a while, they return to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. So now you have to think, okay, what kind of a person goes into a city that he's never been to before and just starts looking for opportunities to talk to people about Jesus? How convicted must they be just to do that? I mean, just imagine that tomorrow I'm going to drop you off in a city somewhere and just say, your job is to talk to people about Jesus. And really, I would like in a couple of months for there to be a congregation. Can you imagine? I mean, that is impressive, the amount of conviction and bravery there. But now, add to that, he gets stoned, left for dead. The brethren drag him away and help him. And then a little while later, he says, I think we need to go back to those cities, including that one where they stoned me. The level of conviction that Paul has cannot be overstated. And so they travel, Barnabas and Paul, back through these areas, and there's several things that we learn in Acts 14. Acts 14 also says that when they went back, they were strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith. So here we've made Christians, but now our concern is we need to strengthen those souls, right? I like the way that Acts 14 puts it. It's strengthening the souls of the disciples, right? What's the emphasis in Christianity? We're not worried about the body, we're worried about the soul. And they encourage them by telling them, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. What's the problem with that statement? They encourage them to continue in the faith, so we're encouraging them, but what's the problem with their mode of encouragement? It doesn't sound very encouraging, right? You know, your encouragement is, you got a lot of problems coming. That comes with the territory, right? But it's true, and they had already seen it with Paul, certainly there in Lystra. And so something to consider is the early Christians did not have the same preconceived ideas that we often run into when somebody becomes a Christian. Typically, in America, somebody becomes a Christian and the general mentality is, I've been baptized, my sins are washed away, I come out of the water, and now life gets better. That's generally, I think, the feeling that we have. What's Paul telling them, though? Now that you're a Christian, continue in the faith, here's my encouragement, life will probably get worse. Through many tribulations we'll enter the kingdom of God. They had no preconceived ideas that this would be an easy journey, which probably says something about why those congregations survived, right? Because if you walk into something and you know it's going to be hard, and you expect it to be hard, and yet you agree to do it anyways, that tells me something about your conviction. So it's not just Paul who has the conviction, it's not just Barnabas who has the conviction, but these early Christians have it too. I mean, the fact that there is a congregation in Lystra after Paul gets stoned is impressive alone, isn't it? I mean, in most cities, if all of a sudden they stone one of the Christians, how many people show up on Sunday? You know, I mean, it's probably not many, right? But here they continue. And so when they go back, they want to strengthen them and encourage them, but they encourage them by saying, it will be hard, it will just be worth it. And I think for us as Christians, there's a lot to be said there that we need to remind ourselves the exact same thing. Another thing that they do as they travel back through these congregations is it says they appointed elders for them in every church. Why is that surprising? Or let me put it this way. It's surprising to me. Why is it surprising to me, and I'm guessing to some others too? Yeah, right. These are not old churches, right? So we're talking churches that are probably months old, maybe at the long stretch like a year and a half old, that sort of thing. We're not talking about wildly old congregations. And they're appointing elders for them in every church. Well, what are some things that tells you about those congregations? Just a variety of things we can deduce just based upon the fact that they were able to appoint elders in every church. So they're faithful people, right? So Paul and Barnabas leave. The church doesn't fall apart with them gone. There were other people holding the line and holding it together. So yeah, that's one thing. We know there are faithful people. What are some other things? Yeah, so we have in every city not just one guy. We have a multiplicity, right? That's the Bible pattern. And we can look in other places like Timothy and Titus at the qualifications for elders. And they had a multiplicity of that in those early churches, which tells you something. Now I'm gonna ask a question. I have my own views on this, but one of the qualifications for an elder is he must not be a novice. So we've just established these are early young congregations. How do you have a young congregation where they're brand new, but you have men who are not novices? How do we get there? Yeah. Yeah, so at least the Jewish converts, maybe not necessarily the Gentile ones, but certainly the Jewish ones, this is a natural transition for at least some of them who would have been well grounded in the Old Testament. So, yeah. Okay, so they're okay. So one aspect is the church did have spiritual gifts, of which those are listed in different places that were helpful, and some of that is divinely given knowledge. So that's certainly going to be a help, right? Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. So they're not new at managing their households well, right? And especially if they had already had ethical standards that they had been applying, especially ones with Jewish beginnings. But there were also many Gentile ones who were often going to the synagogue, and they're applying those things to managing their households, right? So, yeah, absolutely. They're not going to be necessarily a novice at that. They may be uh, baptized at 45 or something like that, right? But that doesn't mean that they started managing their household at 45. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. After, absolutely after. Yep. Okay, here it comes. Mhm. Mhm. Well, one aspect, no doubt, is that they don't have a complete New Testament, right? And that goes back a little bit to what Perry mentioned, where you have these spiritual gifts of prophecy and things like that that are going to help them. But we're just going to get into chapter 15 very soon, and in chapter 15, they're going to have to figure out the question of churches across the board: do we bind circumcision or not? Which tells you, what have these churches not figured out? They got some stuff they're still working on. So if you have quality men, do they have to have the answer to every problem in order to be quality men? No, no, not at all, right? And so that's something for us to keep in mind as well, right? Is as you're looking at those things. Yeah. No. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Yeah. They have a grounding in that Old Testament that's immensely useful. And, and to even to Matt's point, too, think about one early convert we know, Cornelius. Did Cornelius manage a household before he was converted? Yeah, he did. He had servants and sends those devoted servants. And it talks about with Cornelius, before he was a Christian, what was he? He was devout. He was praying regularly, giving alms to the people. So this is a guy who, even as a Gentile, he becomes a Christian. There's already a body of work and knowledge and experience that he's bringing to the table with his knowledge of just the Old Testament. How much more so, especially the Jews, right? That Jewish community that would have that body of knowledge. And as more of the New Testament became known, quality people who are meeting these qualifications, they get more of that knowledge, they're just going to do better, right? Because they're going to grow in knowledge as they gain that. Okay, so these congregations, they're very quickly maturing. That's what I want you to see, is that even as they're making a secondary pass through, they're telling them, look, it's going to be hard, but stick with it, and the churches do. There are quality men there of a caliber enough that they can appoint elders in every congregation, even though, as Scott put it, we're kind of figuring out as we go, right? Things are still moving, and there's a lot of knowledge being gained. These are dedicated people. And I say all that so that we can kind of introspectively look at ourselves and say, we have so much more than they have. Are we doing what we ought to be as both congregationally, but it's really hard to make a decision congregationally, right? Because I can't do anything about the congregation. You can't do anything about the congregation. You can only do something about you. So when you look at yourself and you think about those early Christians and the preaching and the things that they saw and their commitment, what are we doing? Considering we have vastly more available to us to ground us than they did. Many times those early Christians, I think, put us to shame doing so much more with a lot less to work with than what we often do. Okay, from there, they're going to head back to Antioch. And so in Acts 14, they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. This language of Acts is language that Paul will use for his journeys and travels and trials throughout his life and his letters. That it is a grace to be about that work. Now, we just got done looking at, though, what sort of things happened to Paul on this journey that he just finished up. In Lystra, he's stoned. In Perga, John Mark left, and so they're left without one of their workers. They would go into cities and they would love them one day, and then by the time the next Sabbath rolled around, they're driving them out of town. And so they're being chased from town to town, by the way. The people from Antioch find out they're in Iconium, and they chase them down to Iconium, and the people in Iconium find out they're in Lystra and chase them down to Lystra. So they have people who despise them everywhere they go. It'd be real easy to just say, well, man, that was just a ton of work, and so many people don't like me. But Acts 14 says it was a grace of God. All about mindset, isn't it? Right? It's good work. And that was how it was viewed. And Paul, as he talked about his life, which will involve a lot of trials, would say, it was a grace that I could be a part of those. It was a grace that God gave me the opportunity to work in those areas. And so just one of those things where it's useful, I think, to look at the language of the Bible and compare the way the Bible talks about things like the journey of Paul and the language that we might use. I'm not sure if I went through what Paul did, especially in Lystra, I would be saying, I'm really glad God commended me to this graceful work. I'm not thinking that grace would be the word that would be on the tip of my tongue, but that's the language of Acts 14. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. Um, oh yeah. Mhm. Yep. It is, and that's a really good point. Is that Derby is as close as he ever gets to Tarsus, but he doesn't go to Tarsus. He instead says, we really got to go back to these congregations. So he never loses mission, right? He keeps his eyes focused on it. That's a great point. I never thought of it that way. Anybody have any other comments or thoughts? Okay, well then in Acts chapter 15, we'll go and look at this, and I will tell you, we're not going to look at this issue in depth here. One, because our primary goal in this class is to follow the life of Paul. But two, some of the things in Acts 15 we're actually going to look at in the authority class Sunday morning. Because Acts 15 is a great example of following the rules of Bible authority. But in Acts 15, after they get back from this first journey, which it says in verse 28, they spent a long time with the disciples. So there was this, they get back to Antioch, and when they arrive, in fact, I should pause there real quickly, verse 27, 28. When they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all the things that God had done with them and how he'd opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and they spent a long time with the disciples. And that tells you what their view of it is this trip was a wild success. God just opened doors everywhere. Well, again, you could easily think of it the other way. Like, man, it just seemed like there were doors being shut on us everywhere. It all depends on how you want to look at it. And so they spend a long time there, but then this problem arises in chapter 15 where it says, some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas and some others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning this issue. The circumcision issue is a pivotal issue, not because of circumcision itself, but because of what circumcision represents. And in Genesis 17, we are told what circumcision is. It is a sign of the covenant between me and you. The me and you in that case is Abraham and God and Abraham's descendants. It is a Jewish covenant. It is an agreement between the descendants of Abraham and God. So the issue of circumcision ultimately comes down to, and it's even said there in chapter 15, according to the custom of the law of what? Law of Moses, right? The law of Moses. What law are we under? Do you have to be under the law of Moses in order to have Christ? In which case, Moses is the foundation and the Mosaic law, and then Jesus is just built upon that foundation. So if that's the case, then it's really Jesus isn't the way, Moses is the way. Right? And Jesus is just another person building on telling people to follow and build upon the law of Moses, which that's all the prophets of the Old Testament. All the prophets of the Old Testament said that very thing. You know what you need to do? Follow the law of Moses. That was the whole message over and over again. So if we're still doing that, then Jesus is no different than those prophets. Does that make sense? So this is a pivotal issue, not because of the surgery itself, but because of what reason they are saying you need to have it. Paul in his lifetime sometimes will sell like in the case of Timothy, he'll have Timothy circumcised, not because he has to, but just for the sake of evangelism. We don't want this to be an issue. We want to be able to preach to people and them not this not be the issue we have to deal with right off the bat. But the moment Christians say, you have to do this, now what they're doing is they're binding something, they're putting a law in place on other Christians or other people that becomes, if you don't jump over this hurdle, you can't be saved. So what they've done is they've added to the word. Right? They've now said, okay, yeah, you can be saved in Jesus, but only if you do this thing too. Which means we're no longer following Jesus, we're now following men's ideas. And so, yeah. Oh yeah, because if you're going to... Yeah. Well, and you're absolutely right, because what happens is, now just follow the logic, right? Okay, you need to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. Well, why do you have to do it? Because you need to follow the law of Moses. So once you're circumcised, guess what now you have to do? You have to do all the law of Moses, right? You got to keep the sacrifice. You got to clean and unclean food, all that stuff. You got to. So you're right. What happens is it becomes, if you accept A, then you're also going to have to take the rest of the alphabet. And yeah, so that is exactly the problem with it. It's not whether or not somebody is circumcised. Paul will say in his letters, whether you're circumcised or not doesn't matter. Were many Christians circumcised? Yeah, because what were many Christians before they were Christians? They were Jews, so it's fine. But the moment you begin to require the one, to Rodney's point, I mean, you have all of the rest of it comes with it, right? So all the rest goes along with it. Okay. Paul will say in Galatians, so in the book of Galatians, this is a major issue that would affect churches, and the churches of Galatia were particularly affected by this teaching, and so Paul would preach and teach on that in that letter. He says, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he's a debtor to keep the whole law, which is your point, right? If you're going to do the one, then you got to keep the whole thing. And later on in Galatians 6, he says, see with what large letters I've written to you with my own hand. Paul typically dictated his writing. So he would speak, somebody else would physically write it down, but he makes the point of saying, I'm writing this part with my own hand. As many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these would compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. So another issue that came up is, if you will accept circumcision, then now you're just Jews. You're just Jews who also follow Jesus. If you look later on in the book of Acts, the Jewish community had taken to calling Christianity a sect of Judaism. Like, well, you got Pharisees, you got Sadducees, you got the Essenes, and oh, by the way, you got the Christians. We're all Jews, right? And if that's how it is, well, the Sadducees may disagree with the Pharisees, but they can still function together, right? No persecution. We're all on the same team. We're just a little different. One of the benefits, the temptations to accept circumcision was Jewish persecution goes away, which we've just seen Paul's journey. How much Jewish persecution did he get? Everywhere. Yeah, he got a ton of it. They're the primary drivers of his persecution everywhere he goes. So if he would just accept this, that goes away, and you can see the temptation. But if that goes away, then also Christianity really goes away, right? We're now watering down the message. And so one aspect to think about with Paul is, this is a man who will say of himself, I was a Jew of Jews. I mean, I just really was a full-blown Jew in every way. Now, what's he getting up and doing? In Acts 15, it says these men came from Judea, and they began teaching. What was Paul and Barnabas' reaction? What's the language of 15 verse 2? no small dissension, which is a very kind way of saying they had big dissension, right? They had a large disagreement. They had a big fight over this. Paul is now fighting to let in a group of people that he spent his entire childhood saying keep them out. He's now fighting to say, look, this thing that I always said you had to do, I grew up saying if you don't do it, you're cut off from your people. He spent his whole life saying circumcision is absolutely vital, right? Now he's saying, no, it's not. One aspect of Paul that I think is worth noting is it takes a lot of courage to change. Not just to go be stoned, not to just go into a foreign city you've never been to before and talk to people, but to change. Because Paul of 10 years earlier would never have thought of saying circumcision is of no value. Yeah. Oh, no. Harry, you guys? Yeah, that's right. Peter, we know how hesitant Peter was because he didn't want to go. He didn't want to speak to Cornelius in the first place. He had to be given a vision and specifically told, you better go. And yet he recognized if we bind this on them, we're binding the whole law on them. So the principle that we've got to keep in mind is, are we Christians or not? Right? Christians say, let's look what's in the Bible, and we're going to bind the New Testament. We're going to be New Testament Christians. And this is a kind of a fundamental area that battle went down. So the end result of that is that after the testimony of Paul and Barnabas in Jerusalem, and Peter, and James speaks, the end result is they say, okay, we do understand that there are some things the Gentiles are going to have to do in order for us to get along. Because one problem that you do have in churches is Jews and Gentiles, all of a sudden, they're all one group together. Well, culturally, there's an awful lot of differences there. And there's a lot of differences in terms of lifestyle. So there are some things that they're going to have to do. And so they send Judas and Silas. And so in there's a letter that they send with these men in verse 23. And they tell them, look, we know that there have been people who have been unsettling your souls. Right? So that's verse 24. We did not give them any authority or instruction. They've been unsettling your souls. It seemed good to us, having become of one mind, to select men to send to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. So when Jerusalem congregation, led by the apostles and the elders, send this letter and say, beloved Barnabas and Paul, that's a vote of confidence, right? We're buddies with Paul and Barnabas, who were just back in Antioch, and they were having a big fight. And so, if they're beloved, whose side are we on? But they do tell them, we do need you to abstain from some things, and those things are like fornication. You do have to change your life, but you don't need to become a Jew. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on that? Again, we'll talk more about some of the fundamentals of chapter 15 in the authority class on Sunday. Not necessarily this Sunday, but a Sunday. But for now, that fight became something that Paul would have to deal with everywhere he went. Because everywhere he went, there were Jews who were trying to turn the church back into Judaism, turn it right back into following the law of Moses. And so Paul would have to fight that everywhere he went. Any comments or questions? Okay, so Acts 15, they come back from that Jerusalem council. Paul and Barnabas, verse 35, stayed in Antioch, teaching and preaching with many others, also the word of the Lord. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brethren in every city which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. Well, this matches what we already saw. When they got to the end of their journey the first time in Derbe, they said, let's go back. So now they said, well, we need to go back and see those congregations again. This is the first time they're sent. Who sends them? Why do they make that trip in the first place? Holy Spirit does, yeah. Holy Spirit's the one who sends them in the first place. Here, though it's obvious that the Holy Spirit approves of this by the things that we see, the fact of the matter is, this one comes from a conversation between Paul and Barnabas saying, hey, there are Christians out there. What can we do? We need to make sure they're okay. And so they decide that they're going to go and go back and revisit. Verse 39, though, we run into that problem of the sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. If you remember, in Perga, John Mark left. John Mark is a relative of Barnabas. And Barnabas says, let's take him again. And Paul says no. And they have a sharp enough disagreement that they go different ways. There's a happy ending to that story. It does not seem that Paul and Barnabas hate each other or anything like that. They just disagree on how to handle this thing. Which, by the way, since the Holy Spirit didn't say, Paul and Barnabas go back and visit these churches, is it okay that they split up? Yeah. There's not a right or wrong way to do this, right? There's more than one. We just want to take care of Christians, so we were going to go together, but now we're going to split up, and Barnabas and John Mark, you're going to go down to the island of Cyprus, and you're going to go that way, and we're going to go up over the top and visit the churches up there. That's fine, right? Do they disagree about how it should be done and who should go with them? Yes. Does that mean they're not Christians? No. Do they say, okay, well, that's it. We're never going to have fellowship with each other, and I'm not going to ever eat dinner with you again and hate each other? No. Right? They just had a disagreement. That happens in families. Maybe you've never experienced that. But families sometimes disagree, but they can still love each other. And so Barnabas takes John Mark, and Paul takes Silas. Now, Silas has shown up in this chapter for the first time. Acts chapter 15, he's going to show up several different times. It gives us a little bit of context to who Silas is. Verse 22 is the first time he shows up. He's one of the men chosen to go back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And it says, it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And so they choose Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, leading men among the brethren. Very similar to the language of Acts 6, if you remember that, where they picked men to care for the feeding of the widows, and they chose from amongst themselves. The congregation chooses, we need 2 guys to go back with Paul and Barnabas and handle this very important issue and show that we support and love the Gentile Christians, even though we're in Jerusalem, which means, what are 95% of the Christians in Jerusalem, if not 100%? They're Jewish, right? So we got to pick 2 guys to really show that we're with them. So Silas is picked, and it says he's a leading man of the congregation. So this is a guy of a good reputation. And so they send the letter, but they also send it with Judas and Silas. In verse 27, it mentions that they also report the same thing. So in other words, Paul and Barnabas say it, and Judas and Silas do. Verse 32 says, Judas and Silas, also being prophets themselves, encouraged and strengthened the brethren with a lengthy message. The whole thing there about lengthy messages can be strengthening and encouraging. Putting it out there. Oh. Get out. Yes, if you're a prophet, you're guaranteed they'll be encouraging and strengthening. If you are Scott Beyer, you best keep it short. And that was literally the bell right there. And so Silas is a prophet, so we know he's had the apostles lay hands on him, so there are some abilities there. And then another interesting thing is that they go to Antioch, and then when the job is done, Judas goes back to Jerusalem, but Silas decides to remain there. In verse 34, it says Silas decides to remain in Antioch with the Gentile Christians, which tells you something about his heart for Gentiles, right? He was in Jerusalem. They send him up to this Gentile congregation, and he goes, you know what, I think I'll stay put. I can do some good work here. So when Paul decides to go on a journey to go visit Gentile congregations, he needs to pick somebody to go with him. Silas is a pretty decent fit. So as you progress through, what we're going to see now is Paul has some new traveling companions. One is Silas, a leading man and a prophet who has a heart for Gentiles. And then as he travels through, he's going to pick up in the city of Lystra. It'll say in chapter 16, he's going to pick up another guy that you're very familiar with, Timothy. And so just a couple of things to know about Timothy as we wrap up class in the last couple of minutes here. One, Timothy is from the Derbe, Lystra area. In the last journey, what happened in Derbe and Lystra? Right? What's the big thing? Yeah, stoned, right? So Timothy would have known about that. So Timothy knows, okay, when I go and travel with Paul, what happens to this guy on his journeys? And yet, he's willing to go. He's going to voluntarily choose to be circumcised and take on that surgery not as a baby, but as a grown man, which shows you something about his dedication to the cause. And then, as Paul will speak of him later on in life, Philippians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul will say, I have no man like-minded who will care truly for your state. I think as you look at Timothy, you're looking at somebody that Paul looked at and said, you've got the same kind of conviction as me. Now, Timothy's not the same man as Paul, but he's of the same heart. Paul would do anything for the gospel, do anything for these Gentile Christians. And Timothy, what's his ancestral background, his family background? Father's Greek. So does this guy have a heart for Gentiles? Yeah, he does. Absolutely. So here's a guy, he himself is not a novice. Paul will talk about the faith that dwelt first in his mother and grandmother. But he is dedicated to the cause. So now Paul has these traveling companions, Silas and Timothy, amongst others. But these are the two big ones that we know about now. And they are very convicted people. And so Paul's surrounding himself with people of deep conviction too. Okay, any thoughts or comments? Okay, we'll close down there. And next week you have Josh Smith. I am out of the state. I'm in Indiana.